On this episode of the show, I have with me Rishabh Poddar. He is CTO and co-founder at Opaque Systems, and we're going to be talking about privacy within AI. And we're going to talk about the growth of these privacy laws and how they are actually going to impact the industry and what he is seeing in terms of development. And obviously, we're going to talk about synthetic data, confidentiality within RAGs. We're going to talk about building that privacy security from the ground up and how he's seeing that help customers potentially. We got a whole lot to cover. I'll stop talking and introduce Rishabh. Thanks for being on the show, and tell us what your company does.
Thank you so much for having me, Amir. Opaque is a confidential AI platform. Uh, Essentially, that means that Opaque allows organizations to build data in AI applications using their most sensitive data while ensuring that the data remains verifiably uh, private, protected, and sovereign with cryptographic guarantees of these properties. We started out as a research and open source project several years ago out of UC Berkeley's Rice Lab. And today we are working with customers like ServiceNow to deploy secure and compliant data applications.
And the question that comes to mind is, we are seeing a lot of growth of privacy laws. I guess if you could maybe provide us a little context of these privacy laws and how they have AI in mind.
Um, so there are two parts to that question about privacy laws and laws that are trying to regulate AI. Um, Back in 2015, if we take a step back, right, and maybe this goes back into a little bit of why we built Opaque and why we're doing what we're doing. Um, about a decade ago, big data tools, as we call them, were becoming democratized. Organizations of every shape and size were increasingly using these technologies to inform important business outcomes. The next hurdle, as we all saw it, was going to be access to data, access to more data, access to more diverse data, data that organizations could not use because of sensitivity concerns. At the same time, privacy laws globally were getting stricter with the advent of GDPR and laws, countries across the globe following in GDPR's footsteps and laying down privacy laws as data privacy became a first order concern in the world. Um, and these two trends we are seeing today collide with each other. On the one hand, you need access to more data, and on the other, these laws are increasingly causing data to be more and more clamped down. Um, the question is, how do you bridge that gap? How do you allow data to be used to its fullest potential in a responsible and safe way, while ensuring that sensitive information remains protected, but you can still get the insights that you want? Because ultimately, all models will converge given enough data. The only differentiator an organization can have is because of its own proprietary data. Um, but you have to be able to use the data in a way that maintains its sensitivity and respects the data's sensitivity as well. Now, fast forward to today. So, with privacy laws becoming more mature, and now in the US alone, multiple states have privacy laws on their books too. AI is getting increasingly governed and regulated as well. While we haven't really converged and settled on a framework, there are hundreds of laws in the US Congress alone that are trying to govern and regulate AI from multiple angles, not only data privacy. How is data allowed to be used? For what purposes is it allowed to be used? Um, what kinds of things you can do with the data? What sorts of policies and regulations and standards you need to apply on models that are processing the data? So beyond privacy, there is an additional concern or requirement around what you can do with the data. So you need additional guarantees, or you need to think about auditability and compliance and verifiability and enforcing controls on behavior of applications. We need solutions. As an industry, we need frameworks and solutions that allow us to reason about data throughout its life cycle, throughout the data in the AI life cycle, from its inception down to how the data gets used and what insights or responses are produced. Um, Privacy and confidentiality are one element of that. Um, Verifiability, auditability, data sovereignty are other elements of that. Uh, People like to talk about a lot of this under the aegis of responsible AI, so to speak. And if you ask different people, they have different interpretations or slightly differing interpretations. But all of that is about how do you use data in a safe and responsible way.
Absolutely. You know, I appreciate the detailing of kind of where we're at and what we're seeing. I guess the one question that comes up with respect to the speed at which we typically see these type things move forward. I mean, to see GDPR, CCPA, those things took a while.
Yeah.
We're seeing acceleration of what's happening with generative AI. A year ago,
Hmm.
everyone was like, LLMs, and that's going to be what's the thing. Now it's okay. Those are great, but now we're going to have agents actually sitting on behalf of your work. And I'm sure within a year, we'll be looking at this and going, agents are now a part of something bigger. When you think about where we're at and the speed at which development is happening, it almost seems that the laws and those concerns are not half step, couple steps behind.
Yes, yes. Research and innovation is moving in this space at a breakneck speed, right? I remember um, a couple of years ago when we used to have conversations with customers, when people were experimenting with these technologies. Um, they didn't know at the time or have a point of view at the time, and they were trying to develop a point of view on, well, how should they be consuming this technology or using this technology? They know that they need to, because of its promise and potential. But should they be training their own models? Should they be fine tuning models? Should they be using existing models as part of a RAG architecture? What does all of this mean uh, when it comes to data? Because now you're not just talking about structured data around which you can apply nice governance and rules and policies. You can now suddenly consume all forms of data from all forms of applications, structured, unstructured, which has very important or huge implications for the use of data as far as privacy and verifiability goes. And innovation in this space is moving very, very fast as well. What's true today will not be true tomorrow, like you said, right? We're talking about agents today. Tomorrow, is it agentic systems? We are already talking about agentic systems. What happens after?
Mhm.
What are new concerns that come up uh, when you start thinking about these systems? If it was just models, I have to make sure that, okay, my model doesn't remember sensitive information and inadvertently leak it when it's being used. But now, when I start thinking about agents, I have to reason about their behavior as well, because agents, in some sense, are replacing many of the activities that traditional software and humans would undertake. There is an element of non-determinism in their behavior. How do I account for that non-determinism? Because if you have enough agents in a system, then the fact that agents are non-deterministic almost leads to a mathematical probability that one of these, some action that an agent takes could be potentially unsafe. It might leak information outside its intended trust domain or boundaries, or take an action that is harmful in some way. Um, as these systems become more complex, newer concerns will arise. So it's natural, I think, that laws are a couple of steps or maybe years behind because this entire space hasn't settled. I think the answer to, well, what do we do until then is to think of responsible AI or data privacy and sovereignty in terms of future proofing technologies. Security and privacy should not be an afterthought, right? As it traditionally has been. When the internet was designed, for example, it wasn't necessarily designed in a way to account for all the possible threat vectors and ways in which a system could be attacked. Um, that perspective needs to be changed. It is changing. And uh, perhaps with the advent of GDPR. Privacy and security need to be baked into the design of a system from the ground up so that regardless of how laws and regulations evolve, you are able to get the fundamental properties that you need, and you are able to fundamentally apply the kinds of policies and rules that you need from the system to ensure that it behaves safely and well and properly. So, how do you do that? Well, that is where technologies like Opaque's platform come in, because we allow you to build these guarantees from the ground up so that your AI systems remain future proof.
I guess you mentioned something, and it made me actually think about the beginning of the internet and some of the concerns we saw. I do find humans fascinating because I think when we think about privacy and security, we assume they're in the early days of the internet, or even up until a couple of years ago, there's one person sitting on the other side trying to get to our information. Just another bad human, just a bad actor. They're trying to expose our privacy. They're trying to violate our trust. And now we have the thought that AI can do some things on our behalf. And we don't
Yeah.
necessarily know who that is. We can't identify and point a finger to a bad actor. There's a bunch of agents that could be talking and transferring data, infringing upon our privacy. I do find it interesting that people bias towards a human can be accountable. We can point a finger. But the AI, it's technology. It has to be infallible. That is and I talked to a lot of people. I post a lot of content, and that's the number one thing I get back is, but what if the AI makes a mistake? And I'm all like, do you know how often humans make mistakes? I mean, let's just be honest.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts when we're looking at privacy? And if you're building this from the ground up, there's got to be a trust that it's okay, if that makes sense, right? The human's not, I mean, it might be human in the loop, but there's a lot of AI happening that we have to be okay with.
It's a good question. And to your point, with humans, you can have background checks, right? You can have multiple uh, layers of processes to minimize the possibility of grave mistakes. But when you have these complex agentic systems, can you replicate those processes as well? Uh, Perhaps. I think ultimately, really, it all comes down to a question of economics, unfortunately, like everything. Uh, so, at what point does the cost benefit trade off? What is that point in the design space where the costs outweigh the benefits? And it becomes easier or cheaper, perhaps, to enforce the kinds of controls that you need on agentic systems, such that the chances of mistakes are minimized. And in the event that they do, um, well, it's not too bad because it only happens once in a once in a blue moon. Let's just say. Um, I think we will see. I think we will see those processes and governance come in as well. AI guardrails, for example, right, is a direction to ensure that agentic systems or AI applications behave in safe and compliant ways. Um, how good are guardrails today? They're not perfect, but they're fast becoming better and better and better. And given the pace at which this entire industry is moving, I think we will reach a point where we will be comfortable saying that, okay, these guardrails are going that I've enforced on the system to minimize the impact of harm, um, along with my fundamental guarantees of data being protected at all times, given the choice of platform that I'm or technology that I've built my system on. Together, this will get us a long way.
Absolutely. And obviously you mentioned, the guardrails. You mentioned obviously if you're building this from the ground up, you can tend to take a unique view of the problem. And obviously when you mention future-proofing, there's models that change, there's model drift, there's a lot of different impacts. When you kind of look at the life cycle of, and I know there's a whole, AI ops component to this, but when you look at people that are thinking about AI and getting to a larger deployment, right? I think a lot of time we're seeing it, we're seeing some AI, but smaller companies, a lot of enterprises, a lot of proof of concepts. I don't really know if people are fully across the enterprise as invested as they will be in a couple of years, obviously. But when you think about that future proof component, and you mentioned obviously, there's components of Opaque that help. I actually was kind of curious, what are some of the things that people probably just don't understand that they need to be concerned with?
Um, I think let me give you an example, right, of a customer story. So we're working with ServiceNow, and this is all in the public domain, so I can talk about it. In fact, the CEO of ServiceNow, Bill McDermott, he spoke about this use case on CNBC a couple of weeks ago. Um, ServiceNow is building has built many different AI applications, of course, internally, and their entire business strategy is also now pivoted towards being agentic, as opposed to workflows. So they've done a very, very good job at reinventing themselves. One of the key applications that they've built internally is a help desk. So previously, when employees had questions, they would open tickets that would get answered by humans, that would get responded to by humans. That process would take days because the personnel need to be able to pull information from various sources, from financial systems, from HR systems. These systems contain very, very sensitive data that these personnel are not allowed to see in all instances. So the process was lengthy. It took time before a response to the employee's ticket could finally be produced. Now, this entire operation has been streamlined with the help of AI. So now there is an AI application that an employee can visit and ask a question about their salary, commissions, whatever. And now the response is produced in a matter of seconds. Behind the scenes, there is an AI pipeline, right, that is processing, that is taking the user's question and then processing it and responding to it. How? By applying governance and guardrails to ensure safe behavior, by pulling data from various systems, from the financial system, from the HR system, and so forth. Now, the complexity is that all of these data sources that need to be queried or data needs to be retrieved from as part of a RAG pipeline, they are owned by different teams, different business units. They're siloed. And for good reason, because very, very confidential information. Mm-hmm. Each of these silos has its own rules around, has its own governance requirements around who can see the data, for what purposes, and so forth. So even within the enterprise, even within the organization, there are challenges when it comes to being able to use data that resides in all of these complex and diverse systems. So much so that not even other teams within the organization, not even the technology or platform teams, are allowed to see this information. Not even the system administrators who might be able to access the machines on which these platforms are deployed, not even they should be able to access the information. How do you ensure that that data remains protected technologically within the organization? How do you ensure that now it's only being used in permitted and compliant ways as it's being powered by these AI applications and agents and tools? That is where Opaque comes in. This is where our platform comes in and allows and is allowing ServiceNow to, one, make sure that the data remains encrypted at all times. When it leaves the source systems, when it gets processed within the AI pipeline, there is an auditable trail of every action that is taken on the data, and this can be verified by anyone cryptographically. And any policies that are enforced on the data via guardrails are provably enforced as well. So now you have end-to-end protection, starting from the user's query to retrieval of the data to the use of a model to produce responses to the user's question, down to the response being returned back to the user. There's lots of elements that go into the AI pipeline, and you have to think about, well, what are the ways in which I could be misusing data or putting my data at risk And depending on the pipeline or workflow that you're deploying, these risks can manifest in different ways, especially if you're using an external model provider as well, as opposed to deploying models internally. Like I have my AI pipeline and now this is powered by GPT or Claude versus me deploying my own model internally. The harms, the potential risks that you've got to consider vary as well in these scenarios.
Absolutely. That's a great example, by the way. I like that. I guess as you're kind of thinking about your product, right? Obviously, you guys are also trying to see where laws are going, where development's going. It's an interesting intersection because your roadmap is also, I'm sure, several steps ahead, but also might have to factor. I guess a question that I hadn't thought about, but how do you as your team manage that roadmap? Because there's so much development. We just talked about it for the last,
Yeah.
20 some minutes, how
Yeah.
quickly lives are, products developing, laws are lacking. Is that something you have to worry about? Is it a case of I just develop features and when laws come out, I worry about it then?
um, I think the way we look at it, it would be nice, right? Ideally, it would be fantastic if I could have one magic button that I could click and suddenly I could claim that, okay, now this application or this AI workflow is compliant with the EU AI Act, or it's compliant with XYZ regulation. Um, Absent that, we're not there yet. And I'm not even sure if that is the right way of thinking about things because, well, laws are meant to evolve. They're meant to be interpreted, and there is no one solution that will guarantee compliance with all aspects of a particular law or regulation. The way we are looking at it, and I think that's the right way, is to give the customers the tools that they need that they can use to enforce or ensure compliance with various aspects of the law. I need to be able to prove that my data was kept protected for some definition of protection. Then the tool that we give the customer is to ensure that the data remains encrypted at all times. I need to be able to prove that my data was only used for X, Y, Z reasons. And X, Y, and Z can change depending on the law. For example, HIPAA has its own set of requirements. GDPR has its own set of requirements. CCPA has its own set of requirements. That can vary. But as long as I can give the customer the ability to enforce the ways in which data can be used, and the customer then decides, well, I need to be compliant with such and such requirement, and therefore I need to enforce such and such policies. Then we're giving them the tools, the infrastructure to enable compliance. That approach, I think, allows our product as well as the customer's solution to be adaptable to changing requirements with respect to policies and governance and regulations.
I like that quite a bit. That's actually a fantastic viewpoint to have on pretty much everything we've talked about because it is, I speak to a lot of founders and the one thing that I've realized is this space in particular has challenges that a lot of others don't have to deal with. And in your product in particular, even more so because you're actually trying to provide that framework of confidentiality, privacy built in from the ground up. So very interesting conversation. Again, thanks for being on. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Amber. This was very fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. That's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. I think when we talk about privacy within AI, Rishabh did a great job of walking us through the existing laws within privacy, those concerns, actually maintaining some of those future-looking concerns as well, because I think that's actually a big component of this. And we talked about how Opaque actually is tackling some of this and actually dealing with it. He gave us a great example with ServiceNow, and I thought that was really interesting to understand. So please reach out to me if you do have a question. I'll share this episode with somebody else who's interested in privacy within AI. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.